Hello my dear friends, you're on the MilitarySummary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The most important updates are coming from Moscow. As you know, today there was inauguration process of the President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. His term finished today, and he also entered the new term, and the next term, new term of the Putin, will be finished in the 2030s of this century. So another 6 years Putin is going to run Russia, and he's going to be a very big problem, very big pain for the Western and NATO countries. We have a lot of very interesting details, about that inauguration. The inauguration today took place at 12 p.m. of Moscow time. There were lots of people. When talking about the Ukrainians, for example, they didn't recognize Putin as a president. When talking about the United States of America, they recognized Putin as a president of Russia, but they didn't recognize that the Russia's elections were fair. But another important thing that I would like to point your attention, the thing is that today on the inauguration process there were lots of countries as we discussed, and there were 6 European countries, and according to information we have, there were France, Slovakia, Greece, Hungary, Malta and Cyprus. Of course, there are lots of interesting things. We understand why Slovakia and Hungary took place in the inauguration. We know that these two countries are European countries, but when talking about Ukraine conflict, they took the neutral position. But when talking about their neutral position, it was more like pro-Russian position than just neutral position. Of course, I'm not sure why Greece and Malta and Cyprus, participated in this, process. But most likely that's just a question of money or something like this. The most important and interesting guest of the inauguration process was France, of course. During the previous days, we talked a lot that France troopers were redeployed to Ukraine. France troopers were attacked by the Russians in Iskander. France troopers are going to send around 1,500 soldiers and many other things, different events. And now we see the representative of this country on the inauguration process. So the question is, what is going on and why this, the representative just of France visit Russia? No United Kingdom, no representative of United States of America or Germany or other country, but France with Macron, who was planning to send forces on Ukraine. Of course, we need to understand that that wasn't something like the change of position or suddenly France decided to become an ally of Russia or China or altogether or something like this. Of course not. We understand that if France representative was on that process, that means that currently there is a very important negotiation process between Russia and France doesn't want to ruin this negotiation process. Obviously, France is more interested in this, process than Russia. But the question is, what kind of things, what kind of negotiations, and what kind of benefits France are planning or want to get from Putin personally. And the first thing that comes to my mind and is the very important event that is going to take place this summer. And of course, we're talking about Olympic Games. Olympic Games is a very important thing that Western countries required and needs, like a fresh breath of air, and Ukraine as well, because Macron asked and he proposed to stop any clashes anywhere in the world, including Ukraine, to establish ceasefire period during the Olympics period. Of course, it's all these things are being doing not for Olympic Games or in favor of this culture. Of course, the Western countries in Ukraine as well just need some fresh air. They want to stop everything. They need to regroup and understand that exactly during this period of time Russia may be in the most active phase of their offensive, and they just want to stop everything. So the question is what Putin will demand from France for this favor. And also just one thing that Putin can ask Macron in exchange for the ceasefire during the Olympic Games, new president of Russia, we can ask just to allow Russians to act on the Olympic Games under the Russian flag. Russia has everything is perfect in Russia right now. Russia has the best economy in the world, at least the temps or the growth, the speed of growth. Russia is winning on the territory of Ukraine. Russia has allies. Russia building alliance and unions with Iran, with China, with different countries. When talking about Europe and Western countries and NATO itself, we see a significant number of problems. We see that there are lots of camps. One support, other doesn't support the conflict in Ukraine. So that's why the Russians, probably Putin himself, as the first achievement under the new term of president term, wants to allow and to change everything also in Olympic Games. I remind you that Russia was, let's say, dismissed from this, not Russia, but Russian flag was dismissed from the Olympic Games, and now the Russian, let's say, sportsmen are forced to use neutral flag to take part in these games, and most likely Putin may demand France to allow them. Of course, everything depends on the situation, because if Russia are able to break through the Ukraine defense belt, and if the clashes are going to take place, let's say, on the south and on the southwestern part of Kharkiv, when, let's say, the Russians are about to finish the encirclement, of course, Putin will not sign any agreements with Macron, will not go and will not make any changes on the ground. He will continue regarding the Olympic Games, regarding the possibility of act on behalf of the Russian flag. But if the situation is stabilized, or the Russians by the time is able to capture or to take something, of course, this might be a very good benefit for the Russian society in Russia as well. Furthermore, we got additional very interesting reports from Belarus. Today, the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, also announced the beginning of the nuclear exercises, military exercises. For example, on this video we can see how the Belarusians were, let's say, establishing the nuclear missile on the Iskander M, let's say, rocket system. This is the Minister of Defense of Belarus. He stated something about the trainings, about the military exercises, and also the Belarusians involved not just the nuclear forces but also aviation. So a lot of things, and so we see that very close connections between Russia and Belarus. We see that these two countries are moving in one leg, no conflicts, no problems, nothing between the countries, and this is very something that warns Western countries very much. Western countries are trying to separate the Russians from the entire world, but we see that more and more countries support Russia on their road in the world's policy. So we'll see, of course, what is going to be next, but obviously something interesting. And of course, today, inauguration day, the world, the Western countries, the NATO countries were expecting something new, something interesting, something media hot from the Ukrainians. And of course, everybody was watching on Crimea, and everybody was expecting massive missile strike, drone strikes, Navy drone strikes, everything, landing operation, maybe landing from the moon operation or whatever from the Ukrainian side. But when summarized the events that took place on the 7th of May, nothing was conducted by the Ukrainians. I'm not saying that, let's correct a little bit this statement, because nothing was conducted. Most likely the Ukrainians made significant number of attempts to do at least anything to get some media victory, but not to recognize Putin as a president. Despite that, the Ukrainians hasn't conducted their own elections, and for example, a few days ago, Zelensky, let's say, extended another martial law for another period, like as let's say, the president who doesn't have any legal power. So it's very funny from this perspective. So just I remind you that a few days ago, Zelensky, let's say, extended another, once again, martial time and his own president term, because during the martial time, Zelensky continue be as a president or something like this, and his, let's say, legal term will be finished on the 21st of May. So anyway, the Ukrainians made some attempts to attack Crimea, but all those attempts were repelled by the Russian air defense. The only thing that the Ukrainians managed to achieve is to somehow to break through the Russian Navy defense belt to enter the town, the area, and this water and the sea, let's say, surface around the town by the name of Chernomorskaya. And the Ukrainians, as you can see, were flying from one corner to another, trying to find a target that can be attacked by the Navy drone, but they didn't find anything, and they just decided to destroy fish boat. fish boat and just a fish boat or some commercial in this area, or some individual entrepreneur or some organization, but obviously the Ukrainians attacked not even the, let's say, military object or something like this. Anyway, the Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve anything during the previous 24 hours, and of course the Russians are celebrating another victory. Now let's move to the situation on the ground, and first we're going to talk about Kherson direction. More and more updates are coming from the territory. We can see the counter-artillery duels, counter-drone duels, counter-sabotage and reconnaissance force duels. There are very heavy clashes all over the entire bank of Dnipro River. The Russians are attacking the Ukrainians with FPV drones, with aviation, with everything they have, but the Ukrainians from their sides try to repel another Russian attack, and for now we see that the situation is very critical. Not like critical, we can make a conclusion that most likely the Ukrainians will start their own landing operation or something like this, or at least the Ukrainians try to force the Russians to think that they're going to do something, because, or at least when the Russians are going to start their Kharkiv offensive operation. So from the Ukrainian side, everything is ready. And an important note that I would like to discuss with you is that Ukrainians probably for the first time since the battle for Kherson and Dnipro River start using the artillery systems in masses. So the Ukrainians used to use just FPV drones, just sabotage and reconnaissance teams, and now we see that Ukrainians also use artillery. They start something like artillery preparation. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions almost everywhere in the vicinity of in the southwestern Kherson, in the central Kherson, and the most important, the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions in the area of the town by the name of Kreminna. Significant number of geolocations, significant number of FPV drone strikes by the Ukrainians were conducted during the previous, let's say, days, and everything, the concentration of Ukrainian fire, tell us just one thing, that most likely something big is going to happen during the next few days on this direction. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians were pummeling and bombing the Ukrainian positions on their bank of the river, trying to destroy as many as possible temporary positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. For example, on this video we can see another group of Russian FPV drones flying above the area and hunting the Ukrainians, hunting mainly their FPV drones, bases and so on, trying to destroy as many as possible, because the Russians don't want to risk. Everything, as I understand, is already ready. Everything is ready from the Russian side to start offensive on Kharkiv direction. The only thing that the Russians have is that they are not sure for 100% that they can stand and they can hold any Ukrainian pressure, let's say, on Kherson direction. So that's why the Russians currently are doing everything they can to secure the western flank. As soon as they do this, and without even completing this mission, of course, the Russians will do something in Kharkiv. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia direction, to the town by the name of Rabotina. We got a lot of very interesting updates from the territory. The Russians most likely establish almost complete control over the territory. Today we got additional videos from the Ukrainian side of how they were FPV droning the Russian forces inside of the village in the most southeastern part of the area. For example, on this video we can see the Ukrainian FPV drone strikes against the Russian forces. Some building was damaged and destroyed, and this video confirms the Russian presence and the Russian complete control over this territory, which is very important. So we have adjusted the map showing additional progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation, and the strikes took place here. Most likely there are no more Ukrainians in the north and in the northeastern part of the town. Most likely the Ukrainians have already abandoned their positions, and most likely the entire Rabotina is already under Russian control. And if it's true, I believe that somewhere on the 9th of May the Russians will announce this. Now we are moving to South Donetsk direction, to the village by the name of Urozhaina. If you remember, during the previous few days we talked a lot about the things that most likely the Ukrainians have established, the Russians, have established complete control over this part of Urozhaine, and most of the mappers have already updated their maps showing this configuration of the line of combat contact. And today we got the geolocation confirming at least that the Russians entered the area, entered the village. The video was published by the 58th Motorized Brigade. We have the video, significant number of videos of how the Russians using significant number of armored vehicles and tanks were entering the, say, the farms, and how the Russians managed to capture. But then the Ukrainian sources published the video from their side, how they, let's say, landed and counterattack on the direction, and how the Ukrainians, as a result of counterattack, managed to restore control over the farms, or at least this part of the farms. So for now, we're not going to change the map. We are going to continue keeping this area as a gray zone, because we still haven't received, let's say, 100% evidence of Russian control over the entire southern part. From the other side, we continue receiving the videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in Urozhaine, significant number of FABs, artillery strikes, and so on. Most likely the Russians will continue advancing, and most likely, regarding the situation in the southern part, most likely the Russians will try to capture the southern farms completely. Prichistovka, another day, another artillery strikes, another artillery preparation, another artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. So almost every single day we start receiving the videos from the direction. The Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces, which also confirms that most likely this is going to be the next area of attack, and this is the perfect solution for the Russians if they have some plan, if they know what they're doing. Of course, from this direction the Russians have a straight way from Novomayorsk to Prichistovka, then after Prichistovka along the road to Novoukrainka, then to Maximovka, and after Maximovka the Russians have, let's say, straight road to Kurakhova or something like this. So this is the shortest way for the Russians, including the same road from Marinka. But when talking about Marinka, there are very heavy clashes, very difficult to bypass defense belt. Maybe moving from the south is less expensive for the Russians. We're talking about the material side. Now we are moving further to Keramik, to Очеретина, to North Avdiivka direction. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates, and the most important update is coming from the railways. Today the Ukrainian sources published the video, the 110th Mechanized Brigade published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians along the railways. So few important things. First of all, the changes on map. The Russians, we have the real confirmations of the further additional Russian progress to the west. The first thing. And the second thing is that Ukrainians were forced to return back the forces of 110th Mechanized Brigade, which was removed from the line of combat contact due to significant losses during the battle for Avdiivka. But now we see that Ukrainian commanders decided to return this brigade back because the situation on the ground is very terrible and very difficult. Furthermore, as we discussed, most of the mappers shows this territory to the northwest of Очеретина is under complete Russian control, and most likely this is true, so we just haven't received geolocations and updates confirming this. Today we got just the first one about the Russian progress along the railways. So probably this is the current situation, but for now we're going to keep the area as a gray zone. And very interesting details are coming about the further Russian movements. Based on the geolocations, based on the updates we received, the Russians decided to move, at least at this stage of the special military operation, to the west in direction of Progress. The Russians are moving in direction of Novoselovka, Persha, through the town by the name of Solovyovo, Novopokrovska, and Sokol, and the Russians are moving from Berdichi also to the west in direction of Novoselovka, Persha. So this is the current Russian situation. Today we got a lot of geolocations confirming this. We have FPV drone strikes inside of the village by the name of Sokol. The Russian FPV drone attacked the Ukrainian position, the Ukrainian armored vehicle or vehicle that was heading to the line of combat contact. A little bit further to the south in Novopokrovska we have the same video, or almost the same, of how the Russians were attacking the counter-attacking Ukrainian forces, or from this video we can see the forces that were retreating. A little bit to the south we have another video of how the Russians were attacking another Ukrainian tank that was already without, let's say, ammo, and the tank was returning back or moving to the line of combat contact. So based on these three, let's say, geolocations, we can make a conclusion that the Russians are going to move along three roads: the southern Novoselovka, Persha, northern, and in direction Solovyovo, Sokol, then Voshod and Yevgenievka. And of course, we have geolocation of Russian movements along the railways, which the forces are moving to progress. So we discussed that maybe the Russians will try to attack, let's say, the towns like New York and the towns like Toretsk, Valentinovka, Valentiniivka, because today we also got significant number of videos of how the Russians were destroying and bombing the area, reducing everything to ruins. But for now, the Russians are just bombing the territory without any operations on the ground. We can't tell for sure about the Russian plans. Of course, lots of options, lots of things to do. The Russians can do whatever they like. Everything depends on the Ukrainian defense belt in the state and the state of Ukraine army, because of course the Russians also can attack to Grodovka and Pokrovsk, and maybe the Ukrainians have such a big problem so nothing can slow down or to hold the Russians on their way. Everything is possible. Now we are moving further to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction, where we got also significant number of updates. The Russians continue attacking and bombing the Ukrainian positions in Klishchiivka. There are very heavy clashes in the area. The Russians are, let's say, moved to the final stage of Klishchiivka battle with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the area completely. So the Russians are on the final stage. We'll see how the situation is going to develop. Chasiv Yar, the eastern part, regarding the reports from different sources that the Russians have already entered the eastern part, for now we still haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of Russian presence. And when talking about the geolocations of FPV drone strikes, we can make a conclusion that there are still no Russians inside of eastern part of Chasiv Yar, because most of the strikes took place all over the entire town, and so it's very difficult to understand where exactly the Russians may be. So as I understand, the Russians haven't started any offensive before the victory day, and most likely they're not going to do this even today and tomorrow. Maybe after the victory day, which is going to take place on the 9th of May, the Russians may try to do something, but not obviously during the next few days. Now we are moving to Slaviansk direction. This was like a new direction. This is direction along MO3 road. And during the previous few days, we got some geolocations and updates from the territory. The Russians increased their activity. For now, just with FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes, the Russians are clearing the area, the trenches that can be the first defense belt before on the Russian road of attack. And this area, I'll remind you, is the area of responsibilities of 56th Mechanized Brigade and 30th Mechanized Brigade mainly. It's the core brigades who are responsible for defense of the area. And the Russians are attacking the Ukrainians, let's say, from the town of Grigorovka to the north to the town of Vasyukovka. On this video, we can see the Russian multiple launch rocket strike on this area, and this is a very important road because the Russians are about to start their final offensive to Siversk from the south. And to do this, of course, first of all, the Russians need to secure the flank, and to secure the flank they need to capture the village by the name of Vasyukovka. Only after that the Russians can start moving. For now, those were just multiple launch rocket strikes, but maybe this is going to be something more and something bigger. Now we're moving to the southern Kupiansk direction. We had lots of very interesting details and updates. The Russians published the video of how they managed to discover and to destroy another Ukrainian tank who was operating in the area. And as a result of a lancet strike or artillery strike, the Ukrainian tank was destroyed. But that update wasn't the most important. The most important, if you remember, a few days ago we were talking about the situation that currently is a very hot weather in Ukraine, and the hot weather always there is a very big risk of beginning of fire all over the entire Ukraine, because there is no special services, just military forces, lots of explosions, strikes, so it's very easy to set the territory on fire. And today we discussed that, a few days ago we discussed the situation in Kreminna forest, and we made the conclusion that most likely both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, will try to set the enemy positions, the opponent positions, forest on fire, and to break the defense belt of each other. And today we got the first satellite pictures of the fire anomalies in the area, and we see that Kreminna and Serebryanka forest was successfully set on fire by either the Russians and the Ukrainian side. Everything is covered with fire, significant damage to the nature, and the forces, as we can see, are not sleeping, trying to force each other to to fall back. The main fire anomaly from the Russian side is located between Kuzmina and the village by the name of Kreminna. When talking about the Ukrainians, the main fire anomaly take place between Zarechna and Siversk Donetsk-Donbass river. So both sides are trying first of all to suppress artillery, but this leads to the situation of very difficult situation for the forces on the ground. So something big may happen on this direction. Now we're moving to the central Kupiansk direction. We have lots of very interesting updates, and the most important is that the Russians yesterday in the evening and this morning started a very heavy artillery preparation, and they were bombing the town by the name of Stelmakhovka. And starting off today, the Russians conducted and started their offensive operation in direction of the village. The Russians were moving and were attacking the village using few roads from the north, let's say east, and the Russians were started offensive from the northern direction, so using this road. And most likely the Russians managed to achieve some results. We have some geolocations and videos confirming the Russian progress, and based on these two geolocations we can make a conclusion that the main Russian target is to establish control over Berestova and to answer the village by the name of Stelmakhovka from the north, basically to maintain the line of combat contact, to reduce the distance between the Russians in Tabaevka, Krakhmalna, Kislovka, Kotlarovka and Kalamychiha, so make the straight line, and after that to continue moving further to the south in direction of Makiivka, in direction of Liman, in direction of all these towns and cities. This is possibly one of the Russian roads, and of course the Russians will try to move further to the west from Berestova in direction of Sinkova, trying to cut this area in two pieces. During the previous night we got report that the Russians bombed Borovaya with weapon 1500. I'll remind you that this is the main base of Ukrainian forces, and according to information we have, the 3rd Azov brigade was redeployed, have been redeployed in this direction recently. Furthermore, we got another video, another photo of fire anomaly. The Ukrainians also tried to hide the equipment in the forest in the vicinity of Kreminna, in the vicinity of Kupiansk. The Russians bombing this territory heavily. We have lots of videos of how the Russians were hunting the Ukrainian artillery positions, artillery forces, and as a result of artillery strikes, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number. As you can see, the Ukrainians tried to hide their weapon in the forest, and the weather is very hot, and the Russians used this situation to set the forest on fire, to destroy ammo depots, to call the secondary detonations. So the Russians are forcing the Ukrainians to leave the forest. For example, we got another geolocations, another videos confirming that the Russians have a certain focus in the area trying to set the forest on fire. So maybe this is exactly what the Russians were waiting during this part of the special military operation. They was trying to wait when they're going to be very hot weather and using the benefits of the weather to set the main Ukrainian positions on fire, not just in Kreminna and Kupiansk, but of course in Kharkiv as well, because the biggest forest is located to the north of Kharkiv that goes from Kharkiv till the border, and there are lots of Ukrainians in this area. The Ukrainians are using this, let's say, forest as the main, let's say, area where they can be invisible for the Russians, at least used to be invisible. Furthermore, we got more updates of Russian attempts and Russian goals, and let's say, to attack the village by the name of Ivanova. Kharkiv direction, as we can see, significant number of geolocations, lots of artillery strikes, a lot of FABs arrive in the area, so the Russians continue preparations the direction before the greatest Russian offensive, which most likely is going to start after the let's say the Victory Day and somewhere in the second part of May, or maybe earlier, who knows, very difficult to understand because now the situation is developing very fast. Now let's talk about important Kupiansk, another update. Today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 1,540 soldiers. So the losses during the previous 24 hours were the biggest since the beginning of the special military operation, the biggest losses. And the thing is that during the previous 6-7 months, the Russians had just 2 fighting groups. They had and have 5 front lines, but 3 front lines were inactive, so there was like a static front lines, 3 static front lines. The main purpose of those front lines were just to be in the active defense state, and 2 front lines were active. So there was like concentration of 2 attack Russian groups. And now, since the, let's say, May, the Russians involved the 3rd attack group, and as a result of involvement of the 3rd attack group, the Ukrainian losses has been increased significantly. And we are talking about Kupiansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians have lost almost 400 soldiers just on this direction, 335 soldiers. So, and if the Russians continue the same way, and if the Russians continue, let's say, dealing the Ukrainians significant damage, like 1,000, 1,500 losses per day, this can lead to collapse of the front line much faster. Furthermore, we got another report that during the previous 24 hours, somebody was trying to assassinate Zelensky, and according to information we have, that was made by 2 Ukrainian officers, colonels, and they, according to them, that was traitors. Currently, it's difficult to understand what happened with them next. Maybe they managed to escape or not. But this is the first attempt, official attempt from the Ukrainian sources about attempts to assassinate Zelensky by Ukrainian officers who most likely see the situation on the ground and see that Zelensky moved Ukrainian to certain and complete defeat under the Russian pressure. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.